Wide Sargasso Sea is a novella by Jean Rhys, published in 1966. Today we have a lot to unpack: literary elements, title significance, historical context, literary background, summary, themes and symbolism of Wide Sargasso Sea. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Rhys' novel is a work of a multitude of genres, namely post-colonial novel, revisionist or reinterpretation novel, or a prequel, 20th century feminist text, and coming-of-age novel written in the postmodernism tradition. It is set during the post-emancipation 1840s in Jamaica, with some portion in the Windward Islands and ending in England. The narration is through multiple perspectives. Part 1 is from Antoinette's point of view. In Part 2, the narrative voice shifts to Rochester, except in a scene where Antoinette herself narrates, during her visit to Christophine. In Part 3, the narrative shifts to Grace Poole's perspective, and then circles back to Antoinette, but she seems to narrate from beyond the grave. Wide Sargasso Sea alludes to a stretch of the Atlantic Ocean, lying between England and the West Indies, known for its calm, windless conditions and dense seaweed. This title figuratively encapsulates the character's experiences of feeling ensnared, whether physically or metaphorically, between different countries and racial backgrounds. Wide Sargasso Sea reimagines Charlotte Bronte's renowned Gothic Bildungsroman, Jane Eyre, published in 1847. In Bronte's narrative, Bertha Mason is depicted as more monstrous than human, confined for years in Thornfield Hall's attic, undisclosed to Jane Eyre until Rochester's attempt to marry her. Bertha's tragic demise clears the path for Jane and Rochester's union in Bronte's novel. Rhys introduces important alterations to Bronte's text that takes place between 1798 and 1808. First, Rhys shifts the narrative's timeframe forward by several decades, portraying Antoinette Causeway's youth in 1834, a year after emancipation. This temporal adjustment highlights racial tensions and indigenous animosity toward colonizers, positioning Rhys's narrative as an end-of-empire narrative, contrasting with Bronte's tale set during the peak of British imperialism. Moreover, Rhys reconfigures Bertha's lineage from Bronte's depiction, presenting Antoinette Bertha as Richard Mason's stepsister rather than his blood relative. This adjustment directly confronts racial issues, offering a more explicit exploration of colonial power dynamics. Wide Sargasso Sea, set in colonized Jamaica, explores themes of identity and disparity stemming from French and British colonization in the Caribbean. Published during an era of widespread decolonization, it dives into displacement and the aftermath of colonialism. The novel reflects the cultural identity crisis and alienation experienced by Antoinette and Jamaican society after the Emancipation Act of 1833 and echoes the challenges faced by newly independent nations during their political emancipation from former colonizers. Jean Rhys, influenced by first-wave feminism, began her writing career amidst a movement to challenge gender-based inequalities, including voting and property rights restrictions on women. Wide Sargasso Sea was published during the second-wave feminism, a movement for women's liberation. The novel has since become a cornerstone of post-colonial literature, amplifying the voices of those impacted by colonial legacies. The term Creole initially distinguished Caribbean-born descendants of British and European settlers, and evolved to encompass individuals of mixed heritage. Jamaican Creole emerged from interactions between enslaved Jamaican Africans and their English and European enslavers. Rhys' work serves as a post-colonial reimagining of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, focusing on the negative impact of European colonization on Caribbean culture. By giving voice to Bronte's silenced Creole character and exploring Antoinette's backstory before her confinement, Rhys challenges racial stereotypes and critiques colonial practices. Part 1 of Wide Sargasso Sea begins with a young white Creole girl named Antoinette Causeway whose father, once a slaveholder, has passed away, leaving the family in poverty at their rundown estate, Culebri. Her mother, Annette, struggles with depression and often rejects Antoinette, leaving her to spend most of her time with her black nurse, Christophine. An Englishman, Mr. Mason, arrives with his son Richard. Mr. Mason quickly courts and marries Annette despite the vicious disapproval of the servants and locals. Initially, Mr. Mason's wealth brings improvements to Culebri, restoring the plantation and lifting Annette's spirits. However, Annette longs to leave Jamaica, recognizing the animosity of the freed blacks towards the white aristocracy. Ignorant of the escalating tensions, Mr. Mason fails to comprehend the danger they face. One night, a mob sets fire to the house, forcing the family to flee indefinitely. Antoinette awakens 6 weeks later from a coma at her Aunt Cora's home in Spanish Town, where she discovers Pierre, her mentally challenged brother, died in the fire and her mother's subsequent mental deterioration. Aunt Cora enrolled Antoinette in a convent school. With Aunt Cora's departure to England and Mr. Mason's infrequent visits due to his travels, and Annette's later death, Antoinette finds herself largely alone. At 17, Mr. Mason informs her that friends from England are arriving for the winter, hinting at a potential marriage arrangement for Antoinette. The second part takes place after the wedding between Antoinette and her husband, who remains nameless throughout the novel but is supposed to be Mr. Rochester. Richard Mason had paid Rochester to marry his stepsister. As they travel to their honeymoon retreat, Rochester recounts the circumstances that led to their hurried union. Struck by fever upon arriving in the West Indies, Rochester questions his decision to marry Antoinette, whom he barely knows. However, he was enticed by the promise of her substantial dowry by Richard, which grants him financial independence. Crucial due to his dishonorable debts and lack of inheritance under the English law of primogeniture as a second son. Arriving at Grandboy, Antoinette's childhood estate on another island, Rochester feels overwhelmed by the surroundings, wary of the servants, and dissatisfied with the honeymoon house. Antoinette tries to ease his discomfort and familiarize him with Caribbean customs, which initially seems to work. Despite Rochester's initial reservations, they spend several weeks contentedly, bonding through conversation and intimacy, both becoming enamored with each other. Their happiness is disrupted when Rochester receives a letter from Daniel Causeway, who claims to be Antoinette's illegitimate half-brother. Daniel accuses Antoinette of being mentally unstable and manipulative, urging Rochester to visit him for more information. Rochester, swayed by the letter, returns home with a changed attitude towards Antoinette, palpable to her and the servants. The narrative perspective then shifts to Antoinette, who seeks counsel from Christophine, a former servant rumored to practice obeah, a form of dark magic. Antoinette confides in Christophine about Rochester's coldness and asks for a love potion to regain his affection. Christophine hesitates, suggesting Antoinette leave her husband instead, but is shocked to learn of Antoinette's financial dependence on Rochester, as under English law, all of Antoinette's wealth belonged to her husband now. Despite her reservations, Christophine eventually agrees to help Antoinette. The narrative shifts back to Rochester, who receives another letter from Daniel Causeway and decides to visit him. Daniel insults the Causeway family, hinting at Antoinette's incestuous relationship with Sandy, her half-brother, and attempts to extort money from Rochester to keep silent. Aghast, Rochester leaves, but the encounter leaves a mark on him. Returning to Grandboy, Antoinette confronts Rochester about his animosity towards her. He reveals his visit with Daniel. She tries to explain her family's history but becomes distressed in the process. Rochester starts calling her Bertha and suggests they discuss it later and retires for the night, with Antoinette requesting his presence in her room. She secretly drugs his drink with powder from Christophine. The next morning, Rochester wakes up in Antoinette's bed, realizing he was drugged and they slept together. Disgusted and enraged, he seeks revenge by seducing Amelie, a servant girl, with Antoinette's presence nearby. Devastated, Antoinette disappears for days, returning drunk and unkempt, unleashing her fury on Rochester and behaving erratically. Christophine intervenes, accusing Rochester of crushing Antoinette psychologically to the point of biting others and throwing things. Christophine urges him to love her again or leave for England without her. Rochester momentarily considers leaving but changes his mind when Christophine suggests Antoinette might find happiness elsewhere. Furious, he threatens to report Christophine's practice of obeah to the police and orders her to leave. Rochester plans to return to Jamaica to seek medical help for Antoinette's mental instability, metaphorically sketching an English-style house with a woman in one of the rooms on the 3rd floor. They leave days later, with Rochester vowing Antoinette will never return. Antoinette shows no reaction, but a local boy cries, wanting to leave with Rochester, and rejects the boy as he detests everything Caribbean. The last part begins with from Grace Poole's perspective, who acknowledges being well compensated for guarding Antoinette in the attic. Ironically funded by Rochester's newfound inheritance after his father and brother's deaths. Grace maintains her vigilance over Antoinette, who has been imprisoned. The narrative shifts for the final time to Antoinette, who reveals being utterly perplexed. She's lost track of time and place, her memories muddled and fragmented. She's been informed by Grace that she attacked the visiting Richard with a knife, but Antoinette doesn't have any memory of this incident. Struggling with her sanity, Antoinette finds solace in fleeting moments of freedom of stealing keys to the attic at night when Grace Poole sleeps. Recurring dreams of fire haunt her, driving her to the brink of desperation. In one decisive moment, she decides to set the house ablaze, clutching a candle in hand, ready to unleash the flames. Now let's analyze wide Sargasso Sea. The opening lines they say when trouble comes close ranks, and the white people did. But we were not in their ranks, highlight Antoinette's sense of being excluded. Annette is a French-speaking Creole from Martinique. She was my father's second wife, far too young for him they thought, and, worse still, a Martinique girl. Despite her beauty and youthfulness compared to her husband, she is never accepted by the white community in Jamaica due to her outsider status. Similarly, the black community rejects Annette and her family because they were once slaveholders and are now facing poverty after Alexander Causeway's death. Antoinette and her Creole family find themselves marginalized by both the white minority and black majority on the island, experiencing exclusion and alienation. Annette expresses their isolation by stating, "Now we are marooned," my mother said, "now what will become of us," after their horses poisoned, confining them to their estate. Heightening the feeling of being abandoned, lied about, helpless. Referred to as white cockroach, go away, go away. Nobody want you. Go away. By the black population, they are eventually forced from their home by a disgruntled mob of former slaves. Antoinette's sense of being an outsider intensifies within her own family. Her mother's preoccupation with her mentally challenged son leaves little attention for Antoinette. Even attempts at friendship, like with Tia, falter due to racial and social differences. Rochester aggravates Antoinette's identity crisis by repeatedly calling her Bertha, contributing to her succession into madness where she sees herself as the ghost of a woman they say haunts this place. The only places where Antoinette finds some sense of belonging are at the convent school and through her connections with Aunt Cora and Christophine. Similarly, Christophine, Antoinette's black nurse from Martinique, faces exclusion due to her differences from the Jamaican community. Despite living in Jamaica for years, Christophine maintains her Martinique identity through her songs and Martinique fashion of headdress, setting her apart. Her songs were not like Jamaican songs, and she was not like the other women. Rochester's struggle to understand Caribbean culture further highlights the barrier between himself and Antoinette. Daniel Causeway, Alexander's mixed-race, illegitimate child, seeks revenge for his marginalization by writing letters to Rochester disparaging Antoinette and her family. These letters deepen Rochester's distrust and aversion towards Antoinette. In the early 19th century West Indies depicted in Part 1 of the novel, former slaves who toiled on sugar plantations for affluent Creoles are depicted in detail. Despite the Emancipation Act granting freedom to the slaves, tensions simmer as compensation eludes the island's black population, fostering resentment between them and their white employers. Mr. Luttrell, a white ex-slave owner and neighbor to the Causeways, succumbs to self-destruction post-emancipation. Annette keenly senses the undercurrents of animosity pervading employer-employee relations. Antoinette endures taunts from a young girl, singing "White Cockroach, go away, go away. Nobody want you," while her former friend Tia, a black girl, turns violent during a mob attack, injuring Antoinette with a rock amidst the blaze of her family's estate. Trapped in the dilapidated Colibri estate after her husband's demise, Annette feels hopelessly stranded, repeatedly lamenting being marooned. All Colibri estate had gone wild like the garden, gone to bush. No more slavery, why should anybody work? This never saddened me. I did not remember the place when it was prosperous. Both mother and daughter are bound by the legal and financial constraints imposed by their husbands. As Antoinette's marriage to Rochester declines, she contemplates fleeing, urged by Christophine to pack up and go, yet remains indecisive, leading to her literal incarceration by Rochester. Her fiery end, setting ablaze the house of her captivity, symbolizes her emancipatory act and links her to the enraged mob that torched her family's home earlier in the novel. Now at last I know why I was brought here and what I have to do. Christophine, hailing from Martinique, differs from Jamaican servants, while Myra, a former servant, joins protests, abandoning her duties. Amelie, disrespectful to her employers. Sandy and Daniel Causeway, illegitimate children of Alexander Causeway, straddle the divide between black and white society by being mixed-raced. Aunt Cora, briefly overseeing Antoinette, married an Englishman who forbade her return to the West Indies during his lifetime, echoing the disdain for the islands shared by Mr. Mason and Antoinette's husband. Rochester's controlling demeanor reflects Britain's quest to retain dominion over a territory it deemed its own. Madness in the novel is tangled with ideas of fire and female sexuality. Antoinette's childhood and situation worsen her inherited condition of mental health challenges, as she feels excluded and displaced, yearning for love and acceptance. At the convent school, Antoinette is presented with ideals of proper feminine behavior that clash with her passionate nature. The contrast between the poised and imperturbable sisters and Antoinette's fiery temperament exacerbates her sense of alienation. Despite her wealth, Antoinette loses control of her fortune to Rochester, leading to her financial dependence on him. Christophine urges her to leave Rochester when issues arise in their marriage, but Antoinette feels trapped without money or skills to support herself. Annette's despair deepens after losing her husband and facing financial ruin. Her second marriage is seen as an escape from her troubled life, highlighting the vulnerability of women like her and Antoinette who are preyed upon by unscrupulous men. The decline into madness for Annette and Antoinette is directly linked to the anguish and despair brought by their husbands' actions. On the other hand, Christophine is independent, earning her own money and leaving Grandboy when discontented. She advises Antoinette to protect herself and her wealth, highlighting the importance of women's autonomy in a patriarchal society. Woman must have spunks to live in this wicked world, and, all women, all colors, nothing but fools. 3 children I have. 1 living in this world, each one a different father, but no husband, I thank my God. I keep my money. I don't give it to no worthless man. Aunt Cora is a widow who doesn't remarry. She represents stability in Antoinette's life, enrolling her in a convent school, while Amelie uses sexual manipulation to exert influence over her employers. After being intimate with Rochester, she receives money from him and discusses her intentions to relocate to Rio. She wanted to go to Rio. There were rich men in Rio. Women who challenge societal norms or assert their independence face backlash from men. Christophine is pursued by Jamaican law enforcement for her practice of obeah, Caribbean folk magic, and Rochester plans to betray her. Even Aunt Cora's efforts to secure Antoinette's inheritance are ignored, leaving her feeling abandoned. The Lord has forsaken us. Marriage restricts women's autonomy and leaves them vulnerable to exploitation, symbolizing the power dynamic between European powers and their colonies. We'll discuss important symbols of the wide Sargasso Sea. Antoinette finds comfort in the gardens of Colibri Estate when she faces rejection from her mother and ridicule from her friends. To her, the biting ants and sharp foliage are better than people, reflecting her deep sense of isolation and alienation. She compares the overgrown Colibri garden to the biblical Garden of Eden, seeing it as a symbol of lost innocence and decadence. The garden gone wild and snaky-looking reflects the decline from grace. Antoinette's nightmares, set among tall dark trees, further reflect her sense of impending imprisonment in the tall dark 3rd floor of the Rochester estate. Similarly, Rochester is unsettled by the Jamaican landscape, finding it threatening, not only wild but menacing. Those hills would close in on you. His expedition into the forest results in him getting lost and encountering eerie sights like an abandoned house and a mysterious figure he deems a zombie. Dissimilar to Antoinette, Rochester maintains control in his forest exploration, symbolizing his desire to dominate the landscape and Antoinette herself. The name of their honeymoon estate, Grandboy, meaning Great Forest, serves as another ominous forest omen, hinting at the imminent darkness awaiting the couple. Fire plays a central role in Antoinette's life, representing beauty and influence. In Part 1, the fire at Colibri symbolizes retribution and defiance from the former black slaves, resulting in the destruction of Antoinette's childhood home and triggering her mother's plunge into madness. In Part 2, the presence of moths and beetles drawn to the candles foreshadows Antoinette's eventual burning down the Rochester's estate. A great many moths and beetles found their way into the room, flew into the candles, and fell dead on the tablecloth. These insects, along with Coco the parrot, symbolize Antoinette's attraction to flames, hinting at her ultimate act of self-destruction as a means of gaining freedom from her internal struggles. As time passes, this fascination with fire becomes a destructive force for Rochester and Antoinette. While Rochester's consumption is metaphorical, Antoinette's fate is tragically literal, as she meets her end in flames, finally liberated from her tormented existence at the novel's conclusion. Hope you share and subscribe for more videos.